Let's start with where and when you were born. The beginning.
I was born in Dublin, Ireland.
Oh.
And my family moved to the United States when I was 4. So apparently I had a brogue when I was a child, and people would like to come and talk to me, but I've lost it, unfortunately.
Yes, you have. And what month were you born? I'm interested in your astrological sign.
February, so I'm Aquarius.
Then do you identify with being a visionary, independent thinker? I'm sure you do.
Other people will have to tell me that.
Okay. When they came to the U.S., where did they live, your family?
We ended up in Southern California.
Oh, where? I grew up in Southern California.
In Anaheim?
Oh, yeah. I grew up in West L.A.
Okay. That was a nice place to grow up, West
Right.
LA.
And then you got into Stanford, which is a wonderful honor. I went to Berkeley, your rival in football.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about your families. Were they Irish Catholic, or what was their religious, spiritual orientation when you were growing up?
So we weren't really spiritually oriented at all. So really, I didn't grow up with any spiritual belief. So that I grew up really as a sort of scientist, rationalist, as opposed to spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Right. And then what led you to study engineering at Stanford? Why did you pick that field?
So when I was about 5 or so, I went to my brother's high school open house, and I remember going into his physics classroom, and the instructor had a big Van de Graaff generator, and since I was the little kid there, let me hold a light bulb up to it, and it glowed, and I thought that was really fascinating. And then later, when we moved on to other parts of the classroom, I went back and turned on the Van de Graaff generator again so that I could do it. And the instructor came, no, you can't do that. But it just caught me. It was never even a question. I've just been curious and fascinated by how things work. And so when I went to college, I was interested in a number of different things, but ended up in electrical engineering because that's the part of engineering where you're really involved with the physics of how something works. If you're interested, if you look at semiconductor devices and technologies like that, and so that to me was a melding of basic science with applications. And so I suppose I approach life as an inventor, trying to use basic principles to invent something that works.
And you have patents, I read somewhere, that you have, in fact, invented things.
Right, yeah. Patents in a number of different things. I've been working originally in industry and then at the University of Colorado in energy conversion devices. So these were solar cells, then other sorts of technologies that are a lot more exotic. For example, trying to harness zero-point energy. And surprisingly to even me, I have a patent on that. And then most recently, my lab has been working on an alternative technology to solar cells that harvests light as waves rather than as photons, and it's a different way to go. It's still going to be a while until it's practical.
There's a lot of kind of mystique about cold fusion, which has a new name now, low energy nuclear reactions.
Right.
And I've heard stories. People have invented them, and they end up with the men in black suits, take them away, and destroy their invention. What is happening with that?
Okay, so I am going to say something that probably a lot of people listening won't like to hear.
Okay.
And that is, I've worked quite a bit in low-energy nuclear reaction. I've had 2 Ph.D. students working on it. One who got her Ph.D. in that, who finally graduated in that. And I worked with a local company that actually probably has carried out the most rigorous and varied types of cold fusion and low-energy nuclear reaction experiments anywhere, looking at a lot of different technologies from a lot of different people. And in the end of it, I don't think there's anything there. I think that it's due to misinterpretation of measurements and just problems with the experiments. For example, there are 2 main types of low-energy nuclear reaction. One type that uses, this was the Pons and Fleischmann experiment, which consisted of heavy water, a type of water that's reactive in a nuclear way for harvesting energy, and palladium electrodes in the water. Another approach, the other approach uses gas phase low-energy nuclear reaction, in which you have deuterium gas being absorbed in palladium and then presumably producing excess heat, which is the low-energy nuclear reaction. And so there have been a lot of experiments on that. And in fact, when you infuse palladium with deuterium, it does produce excess heat. But it turns out that excess heat is due to a chemical reaction. It's due to the deuterium. I'm probably saying more technically than you're interested in at this point.
No, I'm interested. It could change the whole planet.
It could if it worked. So the deuterium takes the place of hydrogen in water in these cells, and that turns out to be an exothermic reaction. It produces heat. And if you just look at it casually, you might think that you had a nuclear reaction that produced that excess heat. But in fact, it's not a nuclear reaction. It's a simple chemical reaction, and you can reverse it. And when you reverse it, it becomes, instead of being exothermic, it becomes endothermic and cools down. And my student demonstrated this very rigorously, and it just is not a nuclear reaction. And we also took a look at other types of cold fusion experiments, and in particular this company that I mentioned looked at it in more detail than my lab did. And over they replicated other people's experiments, got the same results they did, and then found that in fact it was due to measurement errors. It turns out that measuring heat is not an easy thing to do. It's quite easy to fool yourself.
So if you were in charge of a global, low-cost, high ecological value energy system, would it be solar, or what would you say? Okay, we're going to go this direction.
Okay, so I'm going to give a self-serving answer here.
Okay.
Recently I got a patent for a technology to harvest radiant energy at night. The big problem with solar cells is that the sun doesn't shine at night. Solar cells are actually very good. They're quite efficient. They're quite low cost. The big problem now is energy storage.
Yeah, the batteries.
And if you could generate energy at night as well as during the day, then that would solve the storage problem. And it turns out there is a way to do that. Mm. The sun radiates onto Earth about 1 kilowatt per square meter, which is used by solar cells. The Earth, in turn, is also a warm object, and it radiates. And the Earth radiates roughly 300 watts per square meter. If you could convert that to electricity, then you'd really have a nice technology. The problem is that in order to convert heat to electricity, you need not only a hot source, but you also need a cold sink. And it's the difference in temperature between the hot source and the cold sink that ultimately determines how efficient a conversion technology is. So if the Earth is the hot source, then what the devil is the cold sink going to be? Because everything around us is the temperature of the Earth. Well, it turns out, you want to guess? You want to venture a thought here?
Something about nighttime?
Yeah.
That's as far as I can go.
Okay, so extending that a little farther, deep space is cold. So if you can radiate into deep space, so absorb from the Earth and radiate into deep space, then you have a technology that could generate electricity at night. And so the patent that I recently got through the patent office, describes a method for doing that. And I believe that it is, in fact, feasible. It's not going to be a very efficient technology, at least not initially, but it is a way to generate electricity at night. And I would love to see something like that developed.
And does it use the same kind of solar panels as we're used to?
No, because the radiation from the sun is in the visible or near infrared. The radiation from the Earth is lower temperature and it's in the mid-infrared. And so therefore you need a different type of technology. And so this uses a different type of technology.
And it's stored in batteries?
It just produces electricity. What you do with it is up to you.
Uh-huh. But if I wanted to store it because I'm sleeping all night, then I could put it in batteries.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
How interesting. So what was it like being at Harvard? Because it's probably the premier university in the world, and being surrounded by so many hotshots, is it humbling or ego boosting, or what's the kind of psychological feel from being a graduate student at Harvard?
Okay, so I've got a few answers to that. One is, for 2 years I was a tutor in a dormitory. So a tutor in a dormitory is like, it's called a resident advisor in most other universities. And so I saw a lot of undergraduates go through school and heard their problems and helped experience some of their joys. And it's a tough place. I don't know what the percentage is. Let's say 70% who succeed are going to succeed in life and are really set up for having strong egos and good intelligence and good connections. The 30% or whatever the number is who fail, it's really sad. And it's a harsh environment, as I said, and those who fail really feel stupid. So it was not my favorite environment because of that.
Mm.
I found, having attended both an East Coast school and a West Coast school, I think one can generalize that in the East Coast schools, students are showing or trying to show each other how little they're working and how well they're doing. In the West Coast schools, students are showing each other how hard they're working and how badly they're doing. And
I don't understand the badly. It's just so they won't appear as like they're a snob or something?
Exactly. Yeah, you're just like everybody else. It's not a one-upmanship. It's a camaraderie. And I much prefer the West Coast approach.
And CU is probably more like Stanford, right?
Yeah, CU is West Coast. We really have a West Coast feel, even though we're 1,000 miles from the coast.
Yeah, I think so. I think people would be interested in knowing when have been the most difficult times in your life and how did you cope, so that they know that even superstar academics have times when they had to struggle.
I suppose the most difficult time, one was that when I left grad school, I went against what my advisor had said. He told me, go somewhere where you can learn from other people and advance yourself. And instead, I went to a little startup company in Silicon Valley that was making solar cells. And it was an absolute blast. I loved working there, but nobody else was more of an expert than I was in my particular area. We were all, neophytes. And it was at some point I realized after about 3 years that I needed a community of scientists to interact with. I didn't like being in a lab developing technologies that would remain secret unless they came out as a product. And so I realized that I needed to go academic. And so probably one of the most difficult decisions was to jump ship and say, I'm going to take the risk of going academic, which is a risky venture, and leave this industry, which was quite enjoyable.
It's risky and it's less lucrative, right?
It's risky and it's less lucrative, yes.
And did you have a family by this time? I know you have children.
No, I was at that time I was single still.
And was having a family difficult at times? Because a lot of people say the most difficult part of a marriage is when the kids are born.
So I think most parents of kids who are younger than 20 or 30 would nod when I say one of the most difficult aspects of raising kids these days are screens.
Yes.
And that kids are addicted to screens. And you hear all sorts of experts telling us how bad these are for the kids, and then you ask them about what they do with their kids, and they've given up. Their kids also are on their iPads and iPhones and video games. That's a challenge. It's a real challenge.
And how do you set limits, or how do you cope with it?
I try, but probably not, I'm sure not successfully or as successfully as I'd like to be.
They start them with iPads in kindergarten now. It's part of the curriculum.
Yeah. Yes. I'm teaching a new course in a year, and it's going to be, I haven't figured out the title yet, but it's going to be on new technologies, judging them and looking at the positives and negatives. I was thinking perhaps of calling it Black Mirror. And really taking a look at not just the technology itself, but the social implications of what we're doing, because they're immense.
I've been working on global youth attitudes and activism for a decade, and what I've seen is that kids who are educated and have access to screens, they definitely have a more global and altruistic worldview. Yes. And I have a grandson who's 8. He has this incredible vocabulary, and it's amazing the words that he knows because of the internet. But then I also hear lots of stories of kids don't know how to read body language or facial expression because or we've all heard it and seen it where the kids are in the same room texting each other.
Yes, yeah, exactly. It's hard. Every generation says that the following generation is worse, that they are lacking some of whatever was the previous generation has. And every generation is wrong. The next generation, they're lacking some things, but they've gained other things. And I think what you said is very valid, that our kids are really quite worldly. And maybe their deficits will be made up with other benefits. Right,
because they know about global inequality and hunger and whatever, they care about it.
Yes.
And they want to do something about it. Well, what I know that you were on sabbatical and you got exposed to a Sigh library that got you interested in Sigh. How did that evolve?
So just as you said, this was in 1999-2000. I accidentally came across a physicist's library and was blown away that there was a science of psychic phenomena. Before that, I had assumed that this was all just fuzzy thinking and soft minds. And as I learned about it, it was just absolutely fascinating, and I had to get into it to try to understand this. And it has remained absolutely fascinating. It's probably part of the fascination is that we really don't understand it. And part of what makes it fascinating is that it impacts so much of our lives in so many ways.
I just interviewed James Carpenter, and he says that he thinks that you shouldn't say paranormal, you should say normal, because the whole unconscious draws on Sigh. So
yes.
we're accessing that kind of unconscious information all the time.
Yes. Yeah, I very much agree with him in his perspective. He elucidated it really well in a book a few years ago. And yes, and this really is something that underlies our daily existence once we're aware of it.
How often do you teach your honors course, Edges of Science?
It's been every 2 or 3 years.
When are you going to teach it next?
I don't know. I taught it just under a year ago, so it probably won't be for a few years.
What I thought was really funny is that the process to get it approved as a liberal studies course was very complicated and cumbersome, and they wanted to see your resume to make sure you're a real scientist. And then the other part of this was you felt like your colleagues were just like, we don't want to deal with this, we don't want to know about it, out of sight, out of mind.
Right.
Is that still true?
It's still generally true. I am treated with benign neglect, which is fine.
Oh yeah, that's very good.
Actually, I came out of the closet in a big way just last month. Our university, along with the country and the world for that matter, is getting into quantum computing. And quantum computing is based on quantum entanglement. And we had a big forum at the university last month in which researchers from across the university got up to describe how what they did might relate to quantum computing so that we could find each other and form collaborations. And so I was thinking of getting up and talking about my ultra-high-speed such and such technology in my lab. And then I thought, nah, this is time to come out. So instead, I gave a talk in which I showed some results from Dean Radin and some results from Helmut Schmidt, in which attention affected a quantum process. And I said, we need to really be careful here, because it's quite possible that our attention and intention will affect quantum computers and will affect the entanglement. And I said that publicly, and only one person laughed. So I think it was okay.
Yeah. Was the context working with random number generators, the evidence you gave to them?
With Helmut Schmidt, he was the inventor of the original random number generator based upon quantum decay. And yes, his was based on his electronic random number generator. For Dean Radin's, this was his more recent work, in which he shifts a slit visibility in a Young's double slit experiment using the attention of observers.
He also is working with plasma to, I guess, change the chemistry of the plasma with your intention?
I'm not familiar with that.
All I know is he's changing.
Yes.
She's changing plasma. So the key word that underlines all of the Sigh work is consciousness. So how would you define consciousness?
With great difficulty.
Yeah.
So it really does depend upon the discipline that you're in as to how you would define consciousness. And so I'd like to narrow it and discuss perhaps conscious interaction. And so conscious interaction is, well, I think we're jumping in at the end here, but it's something that's pervasive and really affects everything. And I've come to that conclusion kicking and screaming. Other people were far more advanced in their understanding for many years. And I thought for a long time that we could understand these psychic phenomena based on purely physical models. But I've come to the conclusion that really there is a fundamental nature of consciousness in this universe, and that maybe at some point we'll be able to understand it in physics terms, but not any sort of the models that we have now, certainly.
You said that consciousness, to understand it, is going to involve Sigh phenomena. So does non-locality, like when two photons are entangled and they separate them and we change this spin, the other one instantaneously responds. That's very tempting to say, oh, there's an information field, photon B changed and that influenced photon A, so there's some kind of communication system through this information field for entangled particles, but my understanding is you can't say that.
I agree with exactly what you said. It's very tempting to use quantum physics models to explain psi phenomena, but really we just don't know. Quantum does have interactions at a distance, and so does psi. Quantum does involve effects due to not just the past, but also the future on the present, and so does psi. And so it's very tempting to say that these are that one is due to the other. But if we had lived at the time of Mesmer, when magnetism was just being developed and understood, we'd say, well, wait a minute, magnetic fields give interactions at a distance. And magnetic fields are mysterious and invisible. And so maybe it's animal magnetism, not some other phenomenon that is the underlying physics that makes this work. In every generation, there's a fashionable new concept, and we try to apply that fashionable new concept to whatever it is that's unknown. And right now we're doing that with quantum mechanics and psi phenomena. Maybe there's a connection, maybe there's not. There's nothing that I've seen that's convincing.
What could be a possible explanation why they instantaneously connect to each other, whatever the proper word is?
So are you asking why in a quantum entanglement experiment are two particles instantaneously reacting as a side? Okay. So according to the Copenhagen view of quantum mechanics, that just is the way it is. Live with it. In other words, you probably heard the expression, shut up and calculate. In other words, we can't really understand it. It just is. A actual explanation that I really like is one by a physicist who died recently, Costa de Beauregard. And he was a student of de Broglie. And when he learned about quantum entanglement, he came up as a student with a model for it. And he said, so in quantum entanglement, typically you have two particles that emanate from a single decaying particle. And so they're essentially connected at birth as they go apart. And then whatever you do to one of them is correlated with the properties of another one instantaneously. And so that goes against common intuition. What Costa de Beauregard said is, all you need to do is introduce retrocausality. In other words, whatever you do to this particle goes back in time, affects the genesis of the pairs, and therefore affects this other particle at a distance at what looks like the same instant. But in fact, it's because you went back in time to make that interaction work.
That is interesting.
And I think it's very valid and valuable. And in fact, from Sigh experiments, we know that there is retrocausality. So it's not a big leap to say that, in fact, retrocausality works in an entanglement scenario as well. Turns out de Beauregard wanted to publish this, and de Broglie, his advisor, didn't like the idea and told him no and suppressed it. And so it wasn't until years later, when he was an independent physicist, that he did publish it.
I think there's an Israeli study where patients prayed for 10 years in the future had better outcomes.
Right. Now, that study, that we covered that in my class. The name of the first author is
It starts with a Z or something like that. Zaliski or something like that.
Okay, I don't remember the full one. So yes, and he introduced that experiment just to show how you can come up with illogical conclusions by just applying statistics blindly to a small study. So he actually didn't believe in the result. And in fact, the experiment is a very small experiment. It really doesn't prove anything. And so I fully accept retrocausality. I don't think that experiment shows it.
What's an experiment that demonstrated to you that it does exist?
Oh, lots of them. Dean Radin had a number of experiments in which people were looking at a screen in which an image that was either going to be disturbing or calming was to be shown to them in a few seconds, and they showed the emotional reaction in advance as measured by various sorts of instruments. The cleanest experiment that I really like is one that was initially done by Spottiswoode and May, in which they took a poor subject and put a horn up against them, and this horn blasted at a random time based upon the timing of an electronic random number generator. And what they found, do we need to let that go?
You know what? I'm going to go run and unplug it. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I usually unplug it and I forgot. So they May and Spottiswoode found.
So they found that this subject who was being exposed to a randomly timed horn had a surge, as you might expect, in their skin response, the galvanic skin response, which is a very sensitive measure of your emotional state. And this went haywire after the horn went off, but it started about 2 seconds before the horn went off. And it's a very nice, clean experiment.
But doesn't that show that the future bleeds into the present? It doesn't show that the past influences the present.
So how would we distinguish?
Because I'm reacting to something that hasn't happened yet, so that's present. It's not retro.
But if you look from the perspective of that future person or thing, they're looking into the past.
Oh, I see.
So it really depends what you call, what perspective you're looking at, or looking from.
Then a few other principles that apply from quantum mechanics to Sigh is the observer effect. And
Right.
I think people are becoming more and more aware that it's very hard to separate the intention and belief of the experimenter, even if they're not in the room.
Right. So we know about the quantum observer effect, that according to quantum mechanics, a particular quantum wave function is in a superposition of all possible states, and it can collapse into one final state after it's observed. And
so it could be a particle or a wave.
It becomes particle-like, if you like, after it collapses. And the classical thought experiment for that is Schrödinger's cat, in which the cat is in an indeterminate state until it's observed. And there are different perspectives on what observation means. Most physicists think that observation means simply that it's registered. It could be registered in a detector or anything else. Von Neumann and Wigner had a different view. They said, how can you separate the detector from the experiment that it's detecting? It's all part of a system, and so you could make a bigger system which is detecting what the detector detects. So then that bigger system won't have observed until it detects the detector. And so you can keep on going, and the question was, where does this expansion of detection stop? And they said it only stops with consciousness. That really it's the conscious observer doing the observation that is necessary to actually collapse the wave function into a well-defined state. But this is a minority view in physics, and in fact, there are some physical theories that I like which don't even need an observer effect at all. So I'm not sure that we actually need an observer or need an observer effect. On the other hand, this has been applied to various psi experiments. The first, or one of the first people to do this was Helmut Schmidt, who did a wonderful set of experiments in which he showed that only after something was observed did it go into a well-defined state. And in fact, you could affect what state it went into even days after the process occurred by observing the history of that event.
So if I understand it, they would have data from changing the random number generators with intention. But if it hadn't been observed, you could change it retroactively.
Right.
But if it had been observed, you couldn't change it.
Right. So a way that I like to look at this is by asking the question, can you win yesterday's lottery today? So let's assume that we've got a lottery which is in which the winner is determined by a random process, say picking numbered ping pong balls out of a jar or something like that. And today, you don't know who won the lottery. You didn't look to find out. So can you use your intention to affect what happened yesterday and thereby win the lottery today? And the answer is yes, you can, because we've shown that in various sorts of psi experiments. Just as you said, if you have a random number generator that produces numbers that go into a computer register but nobody looks at it, then yes, today you can affect it and you can change the effect. This leads to what is sometimes cruelly known as the grandfather paradox, where if you go back and in time and you kill your grandfather before he produced your parents, then you would no longer exist, and so that's a paradox. Or I don't like that one, but it's a Bilking paradox, in which you essentially have a future, and then you go back into the past and destroy whatever it was that created that future. And so that's one of the arguments that's used to show that retrocausation cannot occur. But I think that there is a way around that. And if you think about this lottery in which you use your intention to win yesterday's lottery, let's say that you listen to the radio and you hear the first 4 numbers out of an 8-number lottery, winning lottery number. Now you've got knowledge of 4 numbers, and so you cannot go back and change those numbers because you already know what they are. But you are able to go back and change the other 4 numbers. And so really your ability to affect the past has to do with your ignorance of it. The more ignorance, the more ability. And this is also consistent with quantum observer effects as well, in which there's a knowledge perspective. The more you know about something, the less labile that system is. And so I don't think that this paradox, the bilking paradox, is actually a paradox. I think that the more you know about something, the less you can affect it. So if you already knew that you were born and existed, then no, you can't go back and change that. But you can go back and change things that you don't know about.
What's interesting is that lots of studies show that the observer effect, or setting intention, is high at the beginning when people are interested, and then when they get bored, the effect drops off, like reading Zener cards or something, and then it may rise again. So why is it that our emotion is so important in intention being efficacious?
I wish I knew. This is clearly an area of study and some discussion. The question, rephrasing your question, is a psychological effect in which you need the novelty of something happening in order to be able to apply your intention to it? Or is it something inherent to the Sigh itself, so that it actually does wane, in which case there are some models of counterbalancing. In other words, if you affect Sigh in one direction for a while, then nature needs to counterbalance it, produce a little bit of the opposite for a while. And I think this is not resolved, and I certainly don't know the answer.
Bill Bengston said that he tries to pick students to be his mice healers who are skeptics, but he said a student who didn't have good results, his mice died, was embarrassed. So he was embarrassed to be doing this hands on the mice cage thing. Mm-hmm. So embarrassment got in the way of healing the mice.
Yeah, it seems like our emotions do get in the way. So I have a little story about that as to how Sigh works in some cases that I've observed. I think other people probably know more about this than I. But in my office, I have a mind lamp. That's a lamp that was made by Celeron, which has a little electronic random number generator inside it, and that determines which of several colored light-emitting diodes are on. And so it produces different colors that randomly change from one color to another. And the idea with this mind lamp is that you use your intention to affect what color is produced. And as you can imagine, my kids loved playing with it, and to this day, they still, if they're calling me in my office or something, they'll say, "I think it's red." And I look around and see if it is. But what I found, if I sit there and say, "Go green, go green, go green," nothing happens.
Oh.
On the other hand, if I manage to be able to set an intention, I want it to be orange, and then I go away and do something else and completely ignore my intention, put no emotional investment in it. Then I turn around about 10 minutes later, there's a good chance that it in fact is orange. And so if you visit me in my office someday, I'll do you what I do to a number of visitors, which is when they first sit down, I'll ask them to pick a book in my bookshelf, and according to the color of the cover, and say, what color do you like here? And so they'll pick a particular cover, and then I'll say, okay, thank you. And then we'll go on and discuss whatever it is they came to my office to talk about. And 10 minutes later, we'll turn around and look at the mind lamp, and often than not, it's that color.
Does it take 10 minutes usually? It's
not. I haven't done a study. All I know is it's not instantaneous, and I know that if I apply intense emotion to it, it doesn't work. It's more a hands-off intention that works best.
You set it out and then let it go.
Yes.
How does the quantum uncertainty principle apply to Sigh? Once you look closely at something, the other part of it becomes fuzzy.
Okay. So people quote the uncertainty principle as being a quantum mechanical phenomenon. In fact, it's a wave phenomenon. You don't need quantum mechanics for that. So let's say that you have a wave of some kind. It can be a light wave, it can be a water wave, it doesn't matter what. If you look very closely at it, you can tell me where that wave is. But you can't tell me the wavelength, because the wavelength, you've got to look over some distance to see what the periodicity is and so on. If you look over a long distance in that wave, you'll be able to very precisely tell what the wavelength is, but you won't be able to tell me where it is. So any wave has this uncertainty. You can either tell where it is, or you can tell what its wavelength is. And that's the same thing that we see in the quantum uncertainty principle in quantum mechanics. It's two complementary parameters. You can know one precisely and then the other imprecisely, or vice versa. So it's really just a phenomenon that is a wave phenomenon for any kind of wave.
So it doesn't really apply to Sigh directly?
It applies to Sigh probably because it's just a nature of physical reality in general. You look closely at something, you see something different. You look at a distance, and you can see a different property.
Here's a little question. I know that physicists are looking for the unified field theory to unify quantum physics and the physics that explains the world that we live in. Stephen Hawking was looking for it. Has anybody come close to saying, "Oh, this unifies them"?
So I don't know the answer. I mean, this is far out of my domain, but I can give one sort of response, and that is that people are looking at string theory as potentially connecting gravitation and quantum mechanics and electromagnetism and so on. And string theory is one of these grand theories that you can do anything with. I mean, it's so broad and has so many different facets that you can model almost anything. And I'm a little bit afraid of theories like that, because if you say something very grand and broad that could be applied many different ways, I don't know if you've said anything precise enough to explain anything. I prefer a little theory. Just give me a little model that just explains some small phenomenon thoroughly and well and accurately and provably, rather than something very grand that's speculative.
I wonder if they'll ever find it, or maybe they're so different and what the quantum physicists say so weird that it's not possible.
I really don't know. It's a good question. I really don't know.
It's fun to think about. In your ISEAM is in your neighborhood, and it's involved with Holos University. I'm just wondering what kind of research institutions you know about and could list for readers that are doing good science in Sigh.
So really in Sigh there are two extremes in educational institutions and organizations and so on. At one extreme are the more experiential or application-oriented organizations, and ICEAN falls in that category. So they look at healing and the experience of these phenomena. Then perhaps on the other extreme end are the Parapsychological Organization and the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is a little bit broader than the Parapsychological Organization. And they look really at the basic science and trying to understand how can we categorize these phenomena, how can we generalize it, how can we start to understand the ways that it works. And so my interest is more in this perhaps more left brain sort of approach to parapsychology and psi phenomena. The more experiential sort of organizations have, it's wonderful we have them, and I think they satisfy a great human need, but that's just not my perspective.
So would you put ions in the experiential category?
Ions is a little bit in the middle. They were more experiential. They now have a really nice scientific contingent with a number of very good scientists there. And so really I would say they are a little bit of both.
And then there's universities that have, like University of Virginia, Consciousness Studies, and East Georgia that does some paranormal. So it looks like there's some universities have a few classes here and there.
Right, and those tend to be more on the scientific side of things, as opposed to some of the more spiritually oriented universities, which are then experiential as opposed to scientific.
Were last year you were president of the Society for Scientific Exploration?
A few years ago, yeah. It's a wonderful organization, and I'm so relieved not to be president.
It's a lot of work to do that kind of administrative, all those emails and phone calls. Yeah.
It is. I tricked Bill Bankston.
Becoming president.
Yeah, so what I did is I invited him a year to be the program chair for an upcoming conference. And he did a wonderful job at it. And so then the next question to him was, well, Bill, we've got an election for president coming up.
And he said yes.
And he said yes. And in fact, I was speaking to him just this morning, and I said, really, Bill, you're making a mistake in not bringing in some fresh blood to be program chair for our conference, because that's how we'll find the right person for the next presidency.
Right. He told me that he wants the next conference in Boulder in July to be about, okay, we want to get away from the totally materialistic paradigm, but he wants more thought about, okay, what are we moving to? What is the post-materialistic paradigm?
Right.
How would you flesh that out? What is this post-materialist paradigm?
Well, so the title is Consilience. So the connecting of a number of different disciplines with an understanding of the psi phenomena. So it's going to be in early June, just a few miles from here, the conference in Bloomfield. And so what we want to do is not just talk about our own scientific endeavors, but rather, just as you said, generalize them and take a look at where this is leading and how it connects with other disciplines. One simple example is, for instance, if you're a business person and you find several synchronicities in your life, is that leading you to a conclusion that can advise what you're going to be doing in business? And I believe the answer is yes, that it actually can be quite useful.
Right. In terms of applied Sigh, you and your students did some work with associative remote viewing to predict the stock market, and it was so interesting because you did it with symbols where the viewer didn't even know what the symbols were connected to.
Right.
And 7 out of 7 times you got it.
Yes. Yeah, this was something that was taught to us by Paul Smith, who's one of the Stargate trained remote viewers. And he used a technique that was originally suggested by Stephen Schwartz called associative remote viewing. And so the idea here is that, let's say that you have a tasker who's tasking people to do some remote viewing and write down, draw pictures of an image. And you task that, and in your mind, you have associated 2 images with a future event. For example, a picture of an orange might be associated with the Dow Jones Industrial Average going up tomorrow. A picture of a pencil might be associated with it going down. You don't say anything to the people you're tasking other than draw a picture of what I'm going to show you at the end of tomorrow. And so they draw a picture of what you're going to show them. Then the people who are doing the judging take a look at the images that were drawn and ask, are they more orange-like or more pencil-like? And that's actually a fairly easy judgment to make because they're so distinct. And based upon, in this class, based upon whether the majority saw it was a pencil or an orange, we decided that the stock market was either going to go up or go down the following day, and we invested accordingly using
day trading.
Day trading. And then at the end of the day, then we sold, and based upon whether the market did go up or did go down, we showed the people the image that was associated with that to close the loop. And we did this 7 times, and 7 times out of 7 we got it right, and we made a fair bit of money on this.
That's great.
The problem is that, as with most psi phenomena, there's beginner's luck. It works for a while, and then there's some sort of a decline effect. And whether that decline effect is psychological or something deeper, I don't know. And so a number of people have tried to find techniques to avoid it, and with very little success. You can beat the odds. You can do better than 50-50, but you can't get anywhere close to 100%.
I know that the remote viewers did that kind of work with silver trading and were successful, but I don't know of anybody who's done it over time. And it may be the same thing as with the colored lamp, that if you put too much energy on it, it blocks the effect. Maybe.
There's a recent paper published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration by Deborah Katz took a look at exactly what you said, at how one would do in predicting markets over time. And she found that really over time there was this decline effect, and you could not beat the odds.
So that's very simple. You just have a team with new people cycling in all the time for your investment company.
Maybe that's the way to do it, but you may need to not only have a new team, but you may need to replace yourself too, because as the experimenter, you don't want to be involved either. You need to completely be hands-off.
Okay, speaking of hands-off, you wanted to see if you could have the kind of effect without any human beings, having remote generator connected to a computer, impact a remote random number generator connected to a computer, and it worked, right?
Right.
This was reading Zener cards?
No, actually, that was a different experiment.
Okay.
There are a few different ones here. But so talking about the first one that you mentioned. So a few minutes ago, we talked about the experiment by Spottiswoode and May, in which they blasted a horn to a listener. And the listener's response preceded the horn going off. So for years, I've been trying to think of a way to get rid of humans and any living beings and design an experiment that involved just machines to demonstrate the Sigh effect. And so finally I thought of a way to do it, which was to have essentially a replica of that Spottiswoode and May experiment, but have one random number generator, which was the controller random number generator, the agent, and another electronic random number generator that's the subject random number generator. And so the subject random number generator is spewing out random bits which are being recorded by a computer.
Zeros and ones.
Zeros and ones. And then the controller random number generator at a random time switches off the subject random number generator. And the question was, could the subject random number generator anticipate its own demise by putting out a non-random set of numbers before it was being shut off? And so a great student, a grad student of mine in my lab, who worked really hard on this, James Zhu, and also Adam Curry, who was at the time at Celeron, built the physical apparatus for this. And so finally, we set it up in my lab, and James and I were just so excited. We were just tickled that we were finally being able to do this. And so we ran a few hundred runs, and lo and behold, about 1 second before the subject random number generator was being shut off, it started producing more zeros than ones. And we did this again and again, and ended up with a few thousand samples in which the odds against chance were millions to 1.
And it was never more ones. It was always more zeros.
It really produced more zeros. And we were just terribly excited that we now finally got a way to get rid of these sentient sacks of salt water and be able to just use the electronic random number generators. And so then we went about testing different bit rates and different, just changing the scheme a little bit. And it didn't work the way that it did when we initially did it. So then after about 2 weeks, we went back and replicated the original experiment. So same software, same hardware, identical. No effect.
Wow.
No effect whatsoever. There was no change. And at that point, I realized that this was not the machine producing a precognitive effect. It was us, the experimenters, and it was our intention.
Yeah.
We had imbued our intention into the machine.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
So it really was not a machine interaction. And at that point, it finally dawned on me, Garrett, stop trying to just make this out of machines. There's something about consciousness that's a lot more profound here. And I don't want to go to the spiritual realm, but I'm sort of being nudged that way by our experiments.
Yeah, who knows what spiritual means in this context? Is that a synonym for consciousness?
I'm not the right person to answer.
Okay. Then what about the experiment where the Zener cards were drawn by a human remote viewer and the machine? Okay.
So in a remote viewing experiment, as you know, a tasker tasks a remote viewer to draw an image of something that they aren't observing, but either later will observe, or somehow it's associated with a number or a name or something that the tasker gives that person.
Or just an envelope.
Or just an envelope and say, draw what's in this envelope. So a student of mine at the time, Eric Maddox, set up this other experiment that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And that was, we had a envelope which contained one of 5 Zener cards. And so we know the Zener cards from having watched Ghostbusters. So it's got either a wiggly line, circle, triangle, cross.
No triangle. Star.
And so then the tasker tasked the remote viewer to draw what was in this envelope. And the viewer didn't even know that it was a Zener card. They just didn't know anything. And unbeknownst to the remote viewer, in the room, we also had an electronic random number generator, which was spewing out bits which were being recorded by a local computer. Then, after the remote viewing was done, we used, or Eric had a little program which took those bits and created a raster scan image based upon the bits in the computer, where ones consisted of black dots, zeros consisted of spaces. So we had a series of dots creating an image based on the output of the computer, which was fed by this electronic random number generator. Then the judges, in judging the image to determine whether the remote viewer had, which of the 5 Zener cards the remote viewer had drawn, they had 2 different images to judge. One was what was drawn, and another one was what the computer drew. And it turned out that actually, in both cases, the remote viewer was able to get a statistically significant result in getting the right image. But actually, the computer-drawn images were more accurate than what the remote viewer had drawn themselves. And so we call it machine-mediated remote viewing, where you get the machine to draw the images. This was an initial set of trial experiments, and the student graduated, and he's off working in industry, and we have not repeated it. I would love to repeat it and refine this.
And you said there was a way to make the computer do grayscale, so it would be more obvious what the design was?
It would be good to improve this by having the computer do grayscale and just do various sorts of image enhancement. We didn't do anything with that. We just drew a very simple coarse grid.
Did you and the students do the seedling growth affecting it with anger?
This was a student of mine quite a few years ago in the Edges of Science class. What's his name? Did you happen to have it written down there? Okay, he was a great student, and for each student had to carry out a research quality study as part of a publication quality study as part of the course. And so what he did is he got 100 seedlings, each of which was put in its own little pot. And then they were divided into 4 groups. All of them were kept together except when, for 15 minutes a week, in which 1/4 was taken out. 1/4 was the control. They weren't subjected to anything. 1/4 was subjected to torture of plants. So he took a plant, crumpled it up, and put it down the garbage disposal. Another group was subjected to his swearing at it for 15 minutes. And in class, this guy could really swear. I wish we had recordings of what he'd done, but we don't. And then the other group was subjected both to the plant cutting and the swearing. He called it mean speak. And so then after a few weeks, he measured the germination rate and the height of these 4 different groups. And he got a huge difference between the 3 groups that were berated in one way or another versus the control group. And he got odds against chance. I think the p-value was at something like it had like 4 zeros, 0.0007 or something like that. So odds against chance were like 100,000 to 1 or something like that he was seeing an effect.
So the control group grew faster.
So the control group grew faster.
And the one that was sweared at and exposed to torture did the worst?
All three did badly.
Okay.
They did fairly similarly, all three groups that were mistreated.
Another one would be to take a fifth group and say, "Oh, you're so beautiful, I love you, you're so green and vital," and see if they grew faster than the control.
So my last class, one group did that, and because this guy he would not be the right person to be projecting love to plants, but this more recent group was, and they did that, and they saw an effect. But I don't think we can make much of it because they didn't have enough plants to get statistical significance. So we saw an effect, but it was too small a study.
Do you find that mostly men take your classes or not?
No. It's roughly 50-50.
Oh, good.
Perhaps a little bit more women than men, although often it feeds from people in engineering, since I'm in engineering, and there tend to be more male students than female students there. But in general, I think it attracts both.
You did an experiment that you wanted to be simple, to be easily replicated, where glass reflects light, and with your intention, you decide whether it's reflected or transmitted, and that was successful.
Right. The idea there was when light goes through a window or a glass slide, 4% of the light is reflected at the front interface and 4% at the back interface. And if you take a look at this from a photon perspective, you don't know in advance which photon is going to be one that'll make it through, which are the 92% that'll go through, and which of the photons are part of the 8% that are going to be reflected. And so this really is a random process. And so we should be able to, with intention, affect that. So we set up the experiment, measured the reflected beam, measured the transmitted beam, and then applied intention, and did find we could get a significant effect in shifting the number of the amount that was transmitted versus the amount that was reflected.
Did you do it as a group, and do you find that group intention is more powerful than individual intention?
So I didn't do this, but my students who did this did it with individuals. So they took one individual at a time, sitting in front of a computer and the reflection apparatus. We have done group experiments, and we have actually done group experiments with a different intention, and that was we had, for 1 year, I invited a very prominent skeptic to my class. His name was Victor Stenger, and he's actually written several books on skepticism, on how God doesn't exist and so on. And so to his credit, he played along, and he participated in some of the experiments. And we found that whenever he was part of the group that participated in the experiment, we either got a null result or we got a psi missing result, meaning the opposite direction of intention.
Wow. When
he wasn't in the room participating, then the psi experiments worked as expected.
That is so interesting.
So that really does show that everybody around affects the experiment.
What about psibotics? I saw your presentation to the Society for SSE, and that has a lot of implications for health and all kinds of things. How does that work, psibotics?
So the basic idea behind psibotics is to use psi, or use your intention, to program a machine that has some sort of a random process in it, and thereby use that machine to provide a desirable function. And we've actually already described 2 psibotic machines in our conversation.
Random number generators?
No, that by itself is only an element of a psibotic machine. The one where we had two random number generators, one of which shut off another, and that was used to predict a future. That is a psibotic machine because, as we found, we were using our intention to get the second random number generator to pre-spawn to the first random number generator. And if we had set it up, say, to look at what was going to happen a few seconds hence, we would have been able to predict the near-term future based upon that, using that machine. The other psibotic machine that we had was the one that you mentioned, where we used an electronic random number generator with remote viewing, for the machine-mediated remote viewing, in which the electronic random number generator drew the image rather than having a human do it. And so those are two examples of psibotic systems. I proposed this whole notion of psibotics because it would be wonderful if we could actually use this. And I should say, I'm not the first one to do this. Other people have used little robots controlled by electronic random number generators to perform various functions. The question is, can we do this reliably enough to provide some useful function? And therein we get to the two big problems with Sigh experiments, and that is the decline effect and the experimenter effect. That is, things tend to decline in time. They may build back up. And then also, it's very hard to know who's controlling what, because everything has an influence on the machine. And so what I'd like to do in the future is dig into this in some more detail and really look at what is required to build some sort of a reliable system. What can we do, both psychologically and physically, to our systems to enable them to work in a more reliable fashion? And I don't know the answer. I've got a few ideas, but we really need to work them out.
When paraplegics are set up with electrodes in their brain, they can think, lift my leg muscle or something, but that requires a certain brainwave? Right.
That's not psibotics at all. That uses a pickup, which picks up some sort of a brainwave, which is then translated into emotion.
So you have to have a device to pick it up, whereas with psibotics, you don't need that intermediary device.
No, you're using intention to affect a random process.
So ideally, someone who's a paraplegic would be outfitted with something where they think walk, and they would walk.
Right. I wouldn't want to use a psibotic system for that, simply because it's not reliable enough. Sometimes they're going to move forward, maybe 60% of the time, and 40% of the time they'll move backwards. It would be a very frustrating process for them. So we really need a more reliable system here.
Right. Are you going to write a book about all the work that you've done, the Sigh work?
Not in the near future. There are so many good books out there on Sigh. I think we don't need another one. I think, all right, you made a face and you're probably right. If we need other ones, we need them to advance.
Yeah.
What we've done, what we know from previous publications. And so really, I think that at least now, I don't know enough to write something that's going to be innovative enough for readers.
The June conference might fill the void of what's replacing the materialist paradigm. I mean, I think that's where there's a void.
It will address that. It will address that. We're not going to replace it with a single conference or a single set of conferences, but we really are trying to bring up this issue not just to the Sigh community, but to the general science and even business community. So we're trying to make this more generally public knowledge.
Why would a business person care?
Um, well, there are actually a number of businesses that use Sigh advisors of one sort or another. In some cases, it's something like astrology. In other cases, there are various sorts of remote viewing and other techniques that are applied to making business decisions. So these things already are existing. They're already being used. But I think this extends a lot farther. It also extends to human interactions in a work environment. It extends to following our hunches. I think that taking this out of the realm of just being urban wisdom and putting it onto a firm scientific foundation will allow people in various disciplines to say, yeah, I actually have observed these effects and they are useful, and I'll continue to work with them.
A simple example would be like salespeople setting, I mean, I think they do this, but setting a clear intention of their goals for their sales. And if the whole team set the intention, then that could create a kind of an effect.
Sure.
Yeah, I think people know that salespeople do that, but this would be more specific and conscious. Okay, just a few more things. Placebo is getting more effective. I read that somewhere reading about you. Is that really true?
Well, if you take a look at drug trials for antidepressants, there is evidence that placebos when you run a new drug against the placebo, it does less well than if you run the new drug against some old drug that you're competing with. And so I believe, I've read this, I'm not an expert in it, but I believe that drug trials are often done these days not against placebos, but against other drugs, because the placebo has become so damn effective. Is that a Sigh effect? I don't know. I mean, it certainly could be. It could be that the knowledge field, if you want to speak loosely, of how to use antidepressants to affect depression is out there, and you don't necessarily need the actual drug itself.
Or Bengston found that the cradles where the mice were kept that had been resonant with the healing, that you could put a mice in there without any human being and they'd have so that it looks like Sheldrake's, field, what does he call them, the resonant fields? Yeah.
The morphic field and morphogenic field.
That thought forms do create some kind of a change over time, which is fascinating.
It looks like that. As to what the actual process is, nobody really knows. Bill Bengston is unusual in being able to find this very reliably. Is it actually some sort of a resonance field in that environment, or is it somehow in the minds of some of the researchers, or maybe even the readers of that research later? Who knows? Who knows?
Well, I think he said that the water in places like Lourdes, that people think are sacred healing places, has a different composition. So that it does have an effect. That would be an interesting project to go around and measure the water in sacred sites.
Yes.
Or holy water in churches and whatever.
Right.
There's so many interesting things.
It's endless.
Yeah, I know. So what's interesting to me is that Radin's research, everybody's research has these effects, thousands of times beyond chance, but still it's dismissed. So is it just human nature that we oppose a new paradigm, or is it something about Sigh that makes people so reactive, and Wikipedia says, oh, it's just pseudoscience over
Right.
and over about interesting people.
So certainly it is human nature to not want to change our minds. Once we get a particular worldview, it really doesn't change. A couple of years ago, I taught a course called Science Court, in which students chose one of two sides of an argument to debate, and we used courtroom procedures and a judge and jury and cross-examination and so on to look at things that were scientific questions of public interest. And it turned out that the science court was a bit of a failure, in the sense that really the people who were better at arguing won, rather than necessarily a particular side that was more correct won. And I tried changing this by having people change sides partway through the argument, and using some sort of mediation techniques to get a consensus. But I found that once somebody had argued for a particular side, they would not let go. Mm-hmm. They would not let go of their opinion. And everything else that they observed and saw was it was formed around confirmation bias. It confirmed the initial view that they had. So it's really hard to get people to change their minds. And we, in the last few hundred years, are living in a materialistic era in which we believe that everything that is material, and that anything that's non-material, such as consciousness, is just soft thinking. And it's very hard to get away from that. I think in support of the people who are skeptical of these experiments and these results, we don't have a good model to support it. If we had a good model that we could verify and would in some ways explain this, then I think it would be easier for people to jump in and say, yes, I accept this. But as it is right now, self-respecting mainstream scientists and others, psychologists in particular, just refuse to accept Sigh phenomena, at least publicly. Privately, they may. And it's something has got to happen differently for people to shift their view. Maybe it's that somebody starts a company and makes a lot of money using Sigh phenomena. That tends to shift people's view. The way that I'd like to see it is that we develop some models which make a lot of sense. And those models for this phenomena, these explanations, are sufficiently plausible that people can say, okay, yeah, this stuff really exists.
Do you think it would be possible to make a mathematical model?
I think that in order for the model to quantitatively reflect what we're observing, it's going to have to be mathematical. It'll have to involve mathematics. That simply having conceptual models is not enough.
Because that's with string theory, it's a mathematical model, but there's no experiential, there's no experiments that prove it, right? It's purely theoretical math.
As far as I know. So yes, to your point, I think the model has to make some physical sense to us. It's not just pure mathematics, but it's got to have something that we consider an explanation.
What do you do for fun in the face of teaching, research, SSE? What's fun and renewing for you?
Oh, all sorts of things. I mean, I like drumming, I like hiking, music of various sorts, but probably just showing how bad I am, one of the things that I enjoy most is reading and thinking about science and Sigh phenomena. I mean, for me, that is fun. My bedtime reading right now is a book on quantum mechanics. This really is fun.
Oh yeah, everybody is saying that. You're not the only one. but
Yes.
but people also say nature and then the work.
Yes.
Beyond nature. Um, the last question is political, because the context in which we're talking is climate change. Maybe 12 years to turn back the tide of disaster. Autocrats being elected around the world. Trump. Are you an optimist or a pessimist in the face of all this?
So this will betray my political leanings, but right now I'm a pessimist. I just see the rise around the world of totalitarianism and the rise of, or the confusion of fact with fiction, intentional confusion of fact with fiction. And I find that very disturbing. And unfortunately, I think it's going to have to get worse before it gets better.
What is Trump averages 10 lies a day or something like that? So lies are ubiquitous.
Yeah, and I don't want to put it on one person. This really is a worldwide phenomenon right now, and it's it reminds me, unfortunately, of the times that preceded some of our world wars, where truth could not be separated from fiction, and I hope we'll find a way to squeak out of this. But right now I'm not very optimistic.
Right. What makes me hopeful, at least, is that young people, and like the young people, mostly women who are elected to Congress, that they're not afraid. That's very encouraging.
Yes, I agree. I agree fully.
Yeah. Is there anything that we've left out that you would like included in your chapter or your video that's about Sigh?
I'll only know that after we hang up.
But if you're a precog, then you can bring it into the present.
If my precognitive abilities were good enough, but actually they're not.
Do you find that you have more synchronicity in your life, and you do have intuitive flashes because of thinking about these kinds of things?
So before I uncovered the literature on psi phenomena, I thought this was all rubbish. Since I've come to read about it and now perform experiments and so on, yes, I am seeing these effects around me fairly often. And I think once one becomes sensitive to it, it's no longer this abstract phenomenon, but it's an everyday real thing.
What's an example?
One perhaps dramatic example was I was taking a hike with my brother in Ireland, and he, in the middle of hiking up a mountain called the Burn, Barren, he said, "Garrett, call home." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "I don't know, just call home." I said, "Okay." And so I called home and found that my department chair and several other people had desperately been trying to reach me because there was some new institute being set up in Colorado, and they wanted to know whether I would be the director of it, and had tried everything. They didn't know how to reach me, and in fact, the wife of the chair had actually broken into my house to try to find some phone numbers where I could be reached. My brother has never said something like that before that or after that. What was that due to? I don't know.
ESP?
Sometimes.
They really wanted to talk to you.
Yes.
Thank you so much. This was so helpful. So I will